Welcome back to Housebuild TV. This evening we're going to touch on Part F, ventilations in dwellings. I'd like to welcome back Geoff Wilkinson from Wilkinson Construction and Eoghain Ryan from housebuild.co.uk. Thanks a million for joining us again, Geoff. Let's get started.
It's a pleasure as always. Right, so we're going to be moving on to part F in our trip through the A to Z of the building regulations. So part F, as we've mentioned, is all about ventilation. Now, ventilation was one of those areas which really didn't get much attention in the old version of the building regulations, but it's really come to the fore in the course of the past few years, particularly with COVID. Why do I say that? Well, a lot of people were finding themselves at home, and obviously working at home. You're using the air, you use the building a lot more than you would normally in the way things are happening. And so people's attention and the way that they use the buildings was actually very different to the way that they've been using them previously. So that's made everyone a bit more aware of how particularly things are transmitted in the air that we breathe in and around ourselves, and the importance of ventilation just generally within the building, because the more that we're in it, the more that we're using it, particularly if we lock ourselves physically up in it, the more we're recycling the same air constantly throughout that process. And actually getting fresh air into our buildings is very important, because at the end of the day, actually breathing is probably one of the most basic fundamental human bits that we can kind of focus on. So if we can't get there, if we can't get the air, we can't get the oxygen in, we're going to die, aren't we? So yeah, it's a lot more important than perhaps we had perceived it was a few years ago. There have also been a couple of high-profile cases in recent months and years, where the production of mold within the building has created illnesses and deaths within people. There've been a couple of particularly high-profile ones in the past 12 months, and all of a sudden people are actually realizing just how big a health and safety, life safety matter this is. So that's why ventilation has taken on more of a focus than it has previously. Architects in particular seem to have a real hatred of background ventilation. So little trickle vents, for example, that you have in the walls and the windows, they really dislike those for whatever reason that is. So what part F is trying to do is to try and ensure that we get adequate ventilation into the building to make sure that we don't get the problems with the mold, with the quality of the air itself. In fact, the statistics are quite shocking on this. There was a survey carried out by, I think it was the Building Research Establishment on behalf of the government, probably about 8 or 9 years ago now in terms of the actual data set. And that indicated that well in excess of half the homes that are built don't have adequate ventilation to them, which is quite stunning when you think about it. So what's actually happened in recent times? Well, there's been an update to Part F. There's a new version came out in 2022. And this has really got people starting to think about the importance of ventilation in the house. So what do they look like? Well, the first thing that's happened is that there are now effectively only 2 strategies for ventilation of a house. Previously there were 4. I'm not going to go into the 2 that have been removed, but the 2 that still remain are basically background ventilation and localized mechanical extract ventilation. So that's doors and windows with the trickle vents in them, plus extract ventilation. So a mechanical fan, typically in your bathroom, your kitchen, and your utility areas. So those are the areas.
Geoff, we were going to say, does that include your background for then say natural ventilation side, does that also include your purge ventilation for habitable rooms?
Yep. So when we're talking about ventilation, when we're talking about windows, there needs to be, as you quite rightly said, a form of purge ventilation. So purge ventilation is either a door, a window, or a roof light, for example, that you can open, allow some ventilation to come in, and then potentially close back again. Trickle ventilation or background ventilation is ventilation that can be used on a constant basis. So it's like the little slot vents that you see in the top of the windows, for example. It is that mechanism. So there's a bit of constant air change within the building itself. Potentially on upper floors where there are no security issues, you could have what's referred to as a staged opener. So you can actually hold the window in a secured, locked position, but still allows a little gap of air to come in that way. But that's not permitted on the lower levels where there are potentially security risks, because someone could get an iron bar or something in there and jemmy the window open. So that wouldn't be an acceptable means. So it has to be secure as well as providing the ventilation itself. And then locally, as I was saying, in rooms that have particularly high levels of moisture in the air, so that's rooms like kitchens, utility rooms, bathrooms, shower rooms, all of those will need mechanical extract ventilation. Now, that's one of the biggest changes as well in the new regulations, because these have to be fully commissioned, these extract fans. Again, one of the things that has been coming to light in recent years is that the extract ventilation itself isn't actually extracting at the rate that it should be. So typically for a kitchen, for example, the fan would be designed to extract at 30 litres a second. The problem is that every bend, every connection, every time the fan has some resistance to it, that will reduce the effectiveness of the fan. So instead of actually extracting at, say, 30 litres a second, it's likely to only extract down at 25 litres a second. So these are things that potentially cause problems. One particular issue that we regularly see is what I refer to as the use of elephant duct. So it's the stuff that looks like the trunk of an elephant. It's the spun, wired, loose things that you may well have seen them on the back of your tumble dryer, for example. Yeah. Now, that tends to bend, it tends to sag, it tends to get squished by the builders, and all of those things reduce down the effective area. Now, when you've used something like that on the back of your fan, then it's likely it won't just have reduced it down by, say, 15-20%. It may have reduced it down by 50% or more. So it's really affected the effectiveness of that fan to get the ventilation out. Also, if there are kinks in it, then there's a risk of condensation forming in the kinked section. So it almost forms like a trap that you would have within your drainage system, for example. You can end up with water building up over time in there, which can stagnate, and the weight of the water will actually cause the duct to sag ever further. So you can end up with to the point where the ventilation itself is just totally ineffective because it's sagged, because the water's built up and it's dropped down, so it's effectively closed the ventilation up.
Geoff, did you ever notice, well, I've seen it all too often, particularly in 2-story and 3-story houses, where you're venting the bathroom with a mechanical vent, and that flexi coil is lying in the attic and not going directly to the outside. So it's just venting into an attic space. And
Absolutely.
Then that can give mold and water then that comes down onto your ceiling. So many times I've inspected a building that they weren't actually fitted properly.
Yeah,
that's to the outside.
It's one of those things. I mean, that really is another example of bad workmanship. Yeah. So what we would normally recommend is that good design to help prevent that is to try and use like rigid flat duct, for example, which is the sort of oblong section rigid plastic pipe, because each time you're using that, you're reducing the amount of issues that you can have with sagging or with closing up of the ventilation itself. So those are things that can be done to help prevent that, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to end up with the builder not actually connecting it, and that's something else that we see, that there are two sections that are maybe butted together rather than actually connected properly.
There's one thing that I've noticed about the flat pack, and it's not, it's a more robust system, a better system. But if you look at the regulations, particularly where you have protected stairwell, protected entrance hall, and where if your ventilation that passes over it, it has to be in accordance with treble 9.1, has to have fire and smoke dampers on it where it penetrates firewall. And you cannot actually put in fire and smoke dampers into flat pack ductwork or provide
you can't
a fire, or so it's something that should really be tidied up, and what we've advised clients is your route should avoid the protected stairway or entrance hall and serve all the habitable rooms off it. So, but like, it's just one of these nuances of the building regulations, and there's plenty of more in them, including one in Part F where the height below door should be about 10 mil to allow enough ventilation for you to open it, but then Part B says you shouldn't have a gap greater than 3 mil for a fire door. So they contradict each other, but these things hopefully will be ironed out in time.
Yeah, so just dealing with those, so there are effectively three methods by which you can deal with ducts that are passing through a stair. The first one, is, as you say, is smoke and fire dampers. The second one is to protect the duct as it runs through, so you box the duct in, but that has to be fire rated from inside and outside. So that would be the use of, say, Superlux to form the boxing around it. And the third method is where the duct itself is fire rated, which obviously can't be done with the plastic flat duct. So there are ways that you can get round some of those potential issues without it being a huge issue. Just going back very briefly on the 10 mil gap underneath the door, this is where it gets very interesting in the fire door tests themselves, because depending on whether we're using like the European test or the British standard test, the concept of the test is frequently that air is actually being drawn through from the fire test, which actually means that smoke won't come under the door, and so you've effectively got like a negative pressure beneath and a positive pressure from the smoke against the door in the upper forms. So the 10 mil gap is, generally speaking, accepted for the base of the fire door, but then the sides and tops would be where you would normally expect the 3 mil gap to be. So going back to our general discussion on the ventilation systems themselves, the other principal method is the whole dwelling ventilation method, which is where you have mechanical heat recovery type systems. So that's a fully air conditioned house, if you like. Now that's gaining in popularity ever more. Because as we're trying to get our buildings more and more airtight, and because architects hate background ventilation anyhow, the mechanical heat recovery air conditioning type system does seem to be specified far more often than has previously been the case. So they're the two main strategies, as I say, for dealing with ventilation. Under the new rules, both systems, both mechanical elements of it, need to be fully commissioned. So they need to have tests on them to ensure that they're actually extracting at the rates that they're doing. But in addition to that, you also need to make a check that the amount of background ventilation, the amount of trickle vents, the amount of purge ventilation is actually correct as well, and hand that over on a new form of documentation to building control prior to the handover or completion of your project. So there's a lot more for builders to do under this than there has been previously, where they would just get a window that has a standard trickle vent in it and go, right, that's it, my job's done. One of the other critical bits to it is to make sure that the homeowners actually understand what type of ventilation system they've got and how to utilize them. one of the great things, obviously, about the use of electricity monitoring. So most homes now have a little monitor that tells you how much electricity you're using at any particular point in time. That actually discourages people from turning on their mechanical ventilation. So particularly where the ventilation doesn't run continuously, it's intermittent use. It actually acts as a disincentive, because it's like, oh, well, if I turn that on, my electricity bill will be higher. But if you don't turn it on, you'll end up with condensation, you'll end up with mold. The air quality within the building is actually going to be poor, and you're going to start affecting your lungs, etc., over a period of time as a result of that. So it is important for the homeowner to understand how they can prevent the buildup of these toxins, molds, etc. And that's why having specific guidance about when to use it and how to use it is very important. And that's now a standard document that has to be handed over. So if you imagine when you're buying a new car, you'll get a manual that explains how all of the things in your car actually work. So it will tell you how to maintain stuff. It will tell you how to fuel up the vehicle, how to change the tires, those kind of things. Well, how you use the ventilation part is now an important part of the owner's manual that you should be handing over at the end of a project.
And as you say, with cars, you have to change the oil filter. With ventilation, you have to change the filters depending on the manufacturer specifications every 6 months or a year. So, and that's something that'll affect the air quality and breathing within the house if it's not changed.
I mean, one of the things that you classically see 12, 18 months plus on is that the grease filters in the cooker or over the cooker themselves are actually quite frequently clogged, and you can end up almost with dripping grease, unless you're careful, from the filters down onto the cookers themselves, which is obviously a significant fire hazard. So it is important to make sure that you do go through the process of maintaining those as well. Some of the less frequently thought of bits within the regs, quite often you'll get people who are designing extensions. They'll stick, whether it's a conservatory on the back or a rear extension on the back, and you can create what we refer to as an inner room, for example. Now that's in the context of Part F, that's a room that doesn't have any natural ventilation to it at all. So, for example, you maybe are putting a conservatory over the back of the dining room. The dining room previously had a set of patio doors to it, and that was the only ventilation in and out of that room. So you're now only venting into or out of the conservatory. Now that is permitted, providing there's an adequate opening area between the two, and there is background ventilation between the two as well, because all of those are methods by which you can still ensure the ventilation within the building. But it's something that can be forgotten about, particularly if you're putting a rear extension on and your dining room becomes like an internal room then. So that's something to look out for. Another issue that we see is people wanting to put windows in a flank or boundary wall. Now, the problem with that is, apart from the fact potentially you're opening your window into your neighbour's property, which you could kind of overcome by opening it inwards rather than outwards, is that there's a potential for fire risk spread as well. So quite often you'll need to make that window fire rated or fixed shut, and of course that can affect the requirement for the ventilation in the room itself. So that just gives you sort of a quick update on the principal changes. One other thing that's really important that's come into the regulations that didn't happen before is that when you're undertaking building work generally, you have to consider the effect of the building work on the existing ventilation. Now, what kind of things does that include? Well, for example, if you've upgraded the insulation to the building, you may well have made the building a bit more airtight than it was. If you're putting treble glazing in, you're going to be making the building more airtight than it was. If you've knocked out the chimney breast from the building, that's going to make it more airtight than it was. So there's a series of things that you may well have done that will have reduced the ventilation to this building. Now, it may not even have been something that you're doing as part of your project, but have been a series of upgrades or alterations to the building over a period of time. So what the Part F now requires that you do is to start thinking about the net effect of all of these past changes and whether or not you need to be putting in additional ventilation as a result of that. So what it does is it sets out a series of measures or interventions that may have been undertaken over a period of time, and then categorizes them as category A, B, or C, and then you sum up the total numbers of A's, B's, and C's, and that gives you the effect overall that you've had on the ventilation and whether you need to replace them. That takes me on to the really thorny subject of replacement windows. Now, this is something that's been a real kind of bane over the years that's happened. A lot of window installers, if the window didn't necessarily have a trickle vent before, would go, well, they didn't have a trickle vent before, we'll whack in this lovely UPVC, really high performing window, and reduce down the ventilation now to the building as a result of that. So even something as simple as window replacements can have a really negative effect on the ventilation, such that Fencer actually put a guide out to their own members explaining the importance. Fencer are the trade association for window fitters, for anyone that doesn't understand the acronym, because with lob acronyms out like there's no tomorrow in this industry, don't they? So Fencer are the organization that are the licensing body for window fitters. So they had to put guidance out to their own people, because quite frequently the homeowner would say, can we sign a waiver to say that we don't want the trickle vents? And that's not possible. That's an illegal act. You do have to ensure that you've considered the ventilation and put the necessary vents in. So, yeah. Any questions on any of those?
Just one thing. Have you noticed, is there, well, I haven't checked the Part F there, there's a regulation in Ireland that if you provide a warm roof with the air tightness along the pitch, that to provide enough ventilation to the roof to breathe, that provide a counterbatten to allow that on a warm roof at certain angles. So is that the same in the UK?
Okay, so the bit about ventilating roofs and warm roofs and cold roofs was moved effectively from Part F in the past into Part C. So when we talked about the requirements there, so it does depend on the nature of the roof, the type of roofing felt, the type of insulation, the location of the insulation. So there's a series of factors that need to be taken into account when we talk about ventilation of roofs. But as you quite rightly say, it may well be that you need high level vents, you may need additional tile vents or something of that kind to ensure that you're getting the level of ventilation in. Otherwise, the same issue that we have in the room, which is the build-up of condensation, occurs within your roof, and before you know it, your timbers start to rot, which you don't want.
Yeah, perfect. That was brilliant, Geoff. That's
okay.
Very insightful as usual. Well done.
No problem.